through the 90s that intensified both the war on drugs and the level of incarceration in our country, with an order of magnitude increase in the number of people held in prisons and jails. We looked at the incentives provided to law enforcement to enact these laws and a collateral militarization of state and local police forces. In terms of mass incarceration, as we learned, the United States leads the world with less than 5% of the world's population and more than 25% of the world's prisoners, with a disproportionate impact on people of color. And we see now that our criminal justice system has been racialized at every stage in the process. So today we turn to voting rights, and we'll begin with a historical framework, then look at the path to representation for African Americans following the Civil War, and then the adaptive tactics of the white majority that continued for nearly 100 years until Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, considered to be the most significant piece of civil rights legislation ever enacted in the United States. And then we will look at the current assault on voting rights. So we begin way back with the Declaration of Independence, in which Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." And the consent of the governed in the United States is given through the vote. So in the United States Constitution, there is a single clause that speaks to voting. It's Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, and it says, "The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but Congress may at any time make or alter such regulation, except as to the place of choosing senators." Following the passage of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that make up the Bill of Rights, nearly a third of the subsequent constitutional amendments have dealt with voting in one form or another. First, the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, granted citizenship and due process to those who had formerly been held as slaves. And that should have been sufficient to ensure the right to vote, at least for Black men. But there was tremendous resistance, and so in 1870, more explicitly, the 15th Amendment, which granted citizens and all races the right to vote, was ratified. 50 years later, we got around to letting the little ladies vote, the 19th Amendment in 1920. In 1961, residents of the District of Columbia were granted the right to vote for president and vice president, but they are not represented by any voting members in Congress. That was the 23rd Amendment. And finally, and we'll learn some of the history of the poll tax today, in 1964, the 24th Amendment outlawed the poll tax. And during the Vietnam War, in 1971, the 26th Amendment was ratified that reduced the voting age from 21 to 18. Interestingly, it was not until Congress passed the Snyder Act in 1924 that Native Americans, the ones who were here first, were granted citizenship in the United States. One would have assumed that might have given them the right to vote, but in many states that right was abrogated, and it was years before Native Americans could vote in most all states. And then the next significant event, as I mentioned, was the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the path to representation began with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, when the slaves were freed, sort of, and we talked about that extensively in our first class. 1868, citizenship and due process, and 1870, the right to vote, so representation at last. And in that first election, Black voting turnout, that is Black male voting turnout, was 90% of those who were eligible to vote, resulting in the election of 600 state legislators who were descended from or former slaves, 18 state executives, the governor of Louisiana, 18 congressmen, and 2 US senators were African American. And these representatives helped craft laws on finance, on charitable and penal institutions, and on public schools. And it looked to be the start of a new dawn. But the adaptive tactics of the white majority took full force. The Ku Klux Klan had been founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, and that organization took on a significant role in violent opposition to Black voting rights. In an earlier class, we saw the number of lynchings that occurred across the southern states during Reconstruction while federal troops were present in the South to protect the citizenry. And a significant number of these were focused on preventing African Americans from voting. So nearly every year, there were significant mass lynchings designed to spread the message that attempting to vote was a dangerous, if not life-threatening, enterprise. We know that there was significant violence leading up to the 1876 election, and voting among African Americans was depressed for that election process. And there was a deadlock in that election, as we learned, between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes. So the compromise was worked out between Congress and the Supreme Court that Rutherford B. Hayes would be named president if he promised to end Reconstruction. And he did, and they did. And Reconstruction came to an end, and the federal troops were withdrawn. And so violence continued against African Americans as they attempted to vote, and the various southern states began to take legislative action that would make it more difficult for African Americans to cast their ballots. And then beginning in 1890, various southern states held constitutional conventions with the avowed purpose of changing the state constitutions to prevent Blacks from voting. And so in 1890, the Mississippi Plan required that in order to register, potential voters had to be Mississippi residents for 2 years, pay an annual poll tax, and pass an elaborate literacy test, which entailed reading and interpreting a section of the state constitution. Now, this law applied to everyone, Black or white, but the election agent would select the passage to be read and interpreted. And typically it was a single sentence that was presented to a prospective white voter. But one of the incomprehensible passages that had been deliberately included in the Mississippi Constitution to make it impossible to interpret. And those were the clauses that the prospective Black voters were required to read and interpret. And the election agent, always white, was the sole arbiter of whether or not the prospective voter passed the literacy test. And so ultimately, every southern state followed suit in adopting the Mississippi Plan. And so the consequences of this, some of the significant elements, also included the grandfather clause. And what that said was that if your grandfather was eligible to vote before 1865, then you were eligible to vote. And of course, no former slave was eligible to vote before that date. And so it excluded all of the prospective African American voters and enabled all of the white voters to be able to register to vote. Finally, in 1915, the grandfather clause was declared unconstitutional, but Texas grandfathered the grandfather clause, which meant that it was allowed to continue even after it had been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The poll tax, which prevented many poor citizens from voting, but especially the formerly enslaved and their descendants, continued in effect, as we learned just a few slides earlier, until it was finally declared unconstitutional in 1964. And the literacy test continued in force until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so the impact on registration of all of these actions of the Mississippi Plan meant that Black registration dropped from 90% in 1890 to 6% in 1892. Then Louisiana took on its role of adopting a new constitution that was publicly stated as ensuring that white supremacy continued to reign in the South. And as a result of that action, there had been 130,000 registered Black voters in Louisiana prior to the passage of that constitution. And by 1904, there were only 1,342 registered Black voters in the state of Louisiana. And ultimately by 1910, no Southern Blacks could vote. And of course, during this time period, as those decades went on, senators and representatives were elected who passed legislation like the GI Bill and Social Security and the establishment of the Federal Housing Administration, all of which were significantly racist in their consequences. And in fact, by 1940, only 3% of Southern African Americans were registered to vote. But not leaving well enough alone, as court actions began to push for more Black enfranchisement, in 1921, the Southern states came up with the concept of the white primary. In the South, the Democratic Party, it was a one-party system. All Democrats were elected. But as African Americans became eligible to vote and they attempted to join the Democratic Party, they were refused membership. And so there was the Supreme Court case in 1921, Newbury v. United States, where a suit had been filed alleging that African Americans should be able to join the Democratic Party. But the court ruled that these political parties were private organizations and not part of the government election apparatus. And so it was entirely legal for Blacks to be excluded from membership in the parties. And that continued until 1944, when finally, in Smith v. Allwright, the court overturned that prior decision and struck down the white primary as a violation of the 15th Amendment's prohibition against voting discrimination based on race. But it took nearly 25 years for that to happen. And once again, following that Supreme Court decision, Texas Democrats established a private association from which African Americans were excluded, and they held pre-primary elections to name the candidates who would be voted on in the primaries. And so once again, the consequence was all white representatives being elected. And those pre-primaries continued until 1953. At the same time, intimidation did not stop. It shifted format a little, although lynchings to prevent voting by African Americans continued. And this was an image that appeared on the editorial page of the Miami Herald in 1940, just to make sure it was clear what the consequences might be for attempting to exercise your right to vote. Now, we learned that there were many African Americans in the South whose economic circumstance was sharecropping. And so as more and more African Americans attempted to register to vote, one of the consequences was that if they were sharecroppers, they were evicted from their farms, and they typically had nowhere to go. In 1960, 1,400 African Americans registered to vote in Fayette County, Tennessee, and 700 of them were evicted from their sharecropper homes. Throughout the 50s and 60s, scores of these sharecroppers were evicted, continuing well into and not ending until 1965, because it was part of a systematic plan to thwart their ability to vote. Any Black men and ultimately women who registered to vote were required to provide their names of their employers, who could then be notified. And newspapers printed the names of Black people who attempted to register. And then white citizens' councils distributed voter lists to white merchants who denied services to these people who had attempted to vote. Even worse, many of these evicted families were forced to live in tent cities that sprang up throughout the South because they had nowhere else to go. And so year-round, blazing hot summers, wet, freezing winters, people lived in these tent cities, and white segregationist night riders took advantage of the opportunity and terrorized the camps, firing guns into these tent cities during the middle of the night, all designed to help suppress the Black vote, because it wasn't just these people who were involved. Word spread, and it was terribly obvious how dangerous it was to do this. And so this resistance to the implementation of the 15th Amendment continued and intensified. And finally, in 1965, Congress determined that another act, another law was necessary to actually bring the 15th Amendment to reality, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There were three key sections to that act. Section 2 basically reiterated the language of the 15th Amendment, making clear what it was seeking to accomplish. Section 4 contained a formula for identifying jurisdictions that had a history of racial discrimination. And the act also provided that Congress could update and rewrite that formula as time went on if other jurisdictions needed to be included. And so that was the identification piece. And then Section 5 indicated or provided that these targeted areas could not make any changes to their voting laws without pre-clearance from the Federal Department of Justice. And the law also provided that Congress needed to renew the Voting Rights Act every 5 years. It would not exist in perpetuity. So in 1970, Congress renewed the Voting Rights Act for 5 years. In 1975, Congress renewed it for 7 years, and they updated Section 4 to add some jurisdictions that needed more attention. Then in 1982, when Congress took a look at the Voting Rights Act, they renewed it for 25 years. It came up again for renewal in 2006. And at that time, Congress overwhelmingly reauthorized it for another 25 years. The vote was 390 to 33 in the House, and it was unanimous in the Senate. And so support for the protections afforded by the Voting Rights Act received almost universal support. But in 2013, the US Supreme Court handed down its decision in Shelby County, Alabama, v. Holder, Eric Holder, where they challenged the Voting Rights Act. And indeed, the Supreme Court struck down Section 4, which in essence meant that it had no value, no purpose. Now, between 1982 and 2006, that prior 25-year period, the Department of Justice blocked 700 discriminatory voting changes that would otherwise have taken place. And within 8 hours of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder, Texas implemented its draconian voter ID law, the one that had been rejected on the, by preclearance before the Shelby County decision. And so the floodgates were opened for discriminatory voting changes to take place. Alabama issues a photo ID for every resident in public housing in the state. But that photo ID is not adequate, sufficient as a voter ID to vote. In Indiana, in order to get a driver's license or a state ID, you must present your birth certificate. But if you don't have a copy of your birth certificate and you go to get one, you have to have a driver's license or a state ID in order to get your birth certificate. In North Dakota, the legislature passed a law that your voter ID must include your street address. Except that Native Americans living on reservations in North Dakota don't have street addresses. They have post office boxes, and so their IDs are not valid for voting. And in Texas, a third of the counties don't have Department of Motor Vehicles. And it's, in some cases, it is a 250-mile round trip in order to get to the nearest Department of Motor Vehicles so that you can get an approved voter ID. And then we had the myth of voter fraud. I didn't realize, but until 2006, you did not need an ID to vote in any state in the country. You simply had to show up, sign the book, signature matches close enough, and you vote. No state required an ID in order to vote before 2006. But once the Shelby County decision was reached, the state legislatures took on voter fraud with a vengeance. But a constitutional law scholar from Loyola University, Justin Levitt, did a study, and he looked at the period between 2000 and 2014, and he looked at 1 billion votes. And in the process of doing that, determined that there were 36 credible possible cases of voter ID fraud. Not proven, just credibly possible. 36 out of 1 billion. And so the voter ID laws that the states began implementing, some of the ones I've already described, the Alabama situation, Georgia eliminated 12 types of IDs that had previously been accepted and substituted 6 types of government-issued photo IDs. And they had to be issued by the Department of Motor Vehicles, but in Atlanta's 2 counties, almost 2/3 of the people who did not have motor vehicles were African American, and so didn't have driver's licenses and had difficulty with transportation to get to the DMVs in order to get their ID. In North Carolina, Governor McCrory focused on fraud. The North Carolina Board of Elections looked at almost 5 million votes in 2016, and they found 1 voter ID fraud circumstance. But that wasn't enough. The legislature authorized a study to look at the kinds of IDs that Black people had versus the kinds of IDs that white people have. And then they passed a law that specified that the acceptable IDs were those that white people were likely to have. When challenges to that law made it to the Fourth Circuit Court, the judge ruled that that law targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Not being content with focusing on voter IDs, the states began purging voter registration rolls. At the time, there was a law in effect called the National Voting Registration Act. And one of the things that it provided was that you could not purge a voter from the rolls for simply not having voted in a prior election. But that is exactly what these states did. And of course, without the pre-clearance requirement that was afforded by the Voting Rights Act, they could go ahead and do that. And literally millions of voters were removed from the registration rolls because they had not voted in a previous election. Then, emanating out of Kansas, came the cross-check program. Chris Kobach was the sponsor of this. And it looked to determine if there were people who were illegally voting in multiple states. That's pretty tough. I suppose you could travel from state to state to vote twice, but the belief was that there were just hordes of people who were voting in multiple states. And so the cross-check program looked on the basis of first name, last name, and date of birth for matches. And then they would present these matches to the states to say, these are the people who are attempting to vote in your state, but they're also registered somewhere else. Well, this spread to 28 states who shared information in that regard. And Iowa was one of them. And in 2016, Iowa received notice that there were 240,000 registered voters in Iowa who were also registered to vote in another state. And so they embarked on a process to strike the actual offenders from the rolls. And after completing that process, they found there were 6 people who were credibly registered to vote in 2 states. Ultimately, the cross-check program has been abandoned, but more because it created too much work for the states than the fact that it was an inappropriate tool for usage. One of the other things that began happening in states is that they began denying resources to predominantly minority precincts. They limited the dates that were open for early voting or registration. They didn't provide the technological advances to the minority precincts that the predominantly white precincts were able to utilize. And Florida became an example. I think we pretty much remember, I think everybody here is old enough to remember Florida in 2000. Prior to the election, officials were stunned to discover that Black voter registration, which had been 10% of the total electorate in 1996, had increased to 20%. And so they began to look for ways that they could mitigate the impact of that increased African-American registration. One of the things they did was develop a laptop program that they provided to all of the precincts. And what would happen is if you went to vote and your name wasn't on the voter registration rolls, which was frequently the case as people moved from precinct to precinct, there was a laptop program and the election worker could sign into the database in Tallahassee and determine that you were indeed a registered voter. It was just that your precinct was different. Well, those laptops were provided to all of the predominantly white precincts in Florida, but only one of the predominantly Black precincts. And as a consequence, if you were in one of those predominantly Black precincts and you went to vote and your name was not on the list, an election worker had to try to make a phone call to someone in Tallahassee who could then look into the database and see if indeed you were registered to vote. There was one phone line for these calls to be made. Enough said. And even more significantly, most of the predominantly white precincts in 2000 had electronic voting machinery and equipment, but the predominantly Black precincts were the ones with the punch cards and the hanging chads that resulted in so much of the issue for the 2000 election. And intimidation continued. While there were no reported lynchings at this period of time, Republican ballot integrity programs were initiated in the South. Republican agents, sometimes accompanied by local police, would stand outside polling places and warn Black people coming to vote that even an innocent error in their registration, such as a wrong address or incorrect zip code, could subject them to arrest. Blacks seeking to vote were often photographed, with the implication that they could be arrested later if they were found to have violated the law. At the same time, the issue of felon voting rights became an issue. In 2 states in America, Maine and Vermont, you can vote from prison. You never lose your voting rights. In 14 states and the District of Columbia, you lose your voting rights while you're incarcerated, but those were automatically restored when you were released from prison or jail. 21 other states, you lose your rights during incarceration and during probation and parole, typically your full sentence. And in 13 states, you lose your right to vote indefinitely. In many of them, it requires an individual governor's pardon for you to be able to regain your right to vote. And then, if you get that pardon, there is an additional waiting period of some number of years before you are actually able to cast a ballot. You may recall that last year, Florida had a referendum where the general population was asked about restoring felon voting rights, and it passed by about a 2/3 majority. But once it passed, the legislature enacted a law that said, not so fast. We hear that this is something that you want, but we're going to make sure that every fine, every fee, every dollar that any of these former prisoners owes is paid in full before they have the right to cast a vote. Sounds somewhat reminiscent of a poll tax. In fact, it was challenged on the basis of sort of being poll tax redux. But the court said, yeah, but it's not a tax that you're paying to the state. It's a fine that you're paying to the state. It's different. And so it doesn't apply. Another issue that addresses the efficacy and effectiveness of representation in both state legislatures and Congress is the issue of gerrymandering, where voting districts are drawn in particular ways to help guarantee a result. In the last 2016 Wisconsin election, Democrats won 52% of the vote and 39% of the seats. In North Carolina, Republicans won 50% of the vote, and that garnered for them 77% of the seats. And in addition to the inappropriateness, if you will, of the representation, in many instances, these districts result in safe seats, where often there is not even an opponent in an election because there's no point. And so the value of one man, one vote, one person, one vote is significantly compromised by these gerrymandered districts. And then more recently, we've had the decision in the Supreme Court case known as Citizens United, which has enabled enormous sums of money from wealthy donors and dark money sources to flood into the election system and skew the results based on the power that these super PACs and dark money sources have on the consequences of our elections. And then, of course, you have the 2020 election, and the assault is accelerating. 43 states so far have introduced, and this is as of February 19th, the number's probably higher now, In 43 states, 253 bills have been introduced to restrict voting access. If they were to pass, it would be the greatest contraction in voting rights since the period following Reconstruction. Of particular interest in these bills is early and absentee voting. And of course, absentee voting increased significantly in the 2020 election due to the pandemic. But early voting took on increased importance as people became concerned about needing to stand in very long lines on election day, again, given the pandemic situation. And so if we look at the 2020 election, there were slightly more than 158 million ballots cast, a record. Of that 158 million, 116 million were either early or absentee ballots. And in the 33 states that are proposing limits on these features, 85 million votes were cast using these features during the 2020 election. So those states are potentially impacting the mechanism used by 85 of the 158 million votes in 2020. In addition to the direct assault on early and absentee voting, Georgia would make it a crime to offer water for free to voters standing in line waiting to vote. And Alabama plans to eliminate its straight ticket voting option, which would mean that it would take longer to vote and have a more significant impact in the length of time that people stand in line if casting each person's vote takes longer. And there are a horde of others. But it's been interesting to note that in some of these states, these laws that have been proposed, these bills that have been proposed, have been designed to appeal to those people who subscribe to the view that the 2020 election was stolen. But these representatives in the state legislatures had no expectation that they would actually come to a vote, but they are. And now, in some cases, these legislators are being faced with the choice of voting in favor of these restrictions, which may help them in either holding or forestalling primary elections, but have the potential to hurt them when it comes time for the general election. Too bad for them. So what could help? Automatic voter registration. It exists in a number of states where once you're 18, you are automatically registered to vote. Independent districting commissions, not making it a function of the party in power after each 10-year census to do the redistricting work. Make Election Day a national holiday. What's more American than voting? Well, depending on who you are. But if the 4th of July is a national holiday, why not make Election Day a national holiday so that no one has to make a choice between working and casting their vote? Enforce the National Voting Rights Act that prevents people from being removed from voter registration rolls for not having voted earlier. And pass the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is the new version of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then our own personal advocacy in support of meaningful, logical, rational, thoughtful bills. Contact our representatives at the state and federal level to voice our support for access to the ballot box for all. And finally, the House has passed H.R. 1, which focuses on voting, elections, and ethics. And I would say it's awaiting Senate action, but actually it's just sitting on somebody's desk. But it is a significant issue, and as you know, as you're probably aware from looking at the news, it is the source of considerable attention to the filibuster in the Senate. And there are proposals to eliminate the filibuster. There are proposals to exempt voting rights laws from the filibuster. So there are a number of ways to come at this question. There are also some people on the Republican side who are thinking that a bill like this is appropriate to be considered and potentially passed by the Senate. But what it does, it sets universal mail ballot standards, and it establishes an automatic voter registration system. It allows for same-day registration. It provides that early voting would be available to the electorate for a minimum of 15 days prior to Election Day. And it requires that the hours that the polls are open would include some hours beyond the 9 to 5 time period that is often all that is allowed. And it would prohibit these voter roll purges that have been taking place in recent years. It would establish nonpartisan redistricting commission rules for each state, where there would be 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 5 independents who would be accountable for developing the district lines, and that there would be opportunities for public comment when those districts were developed, and the opportunity to challenge the districting lines if necessary. In terms of campaign finance disclosures, it would focus on the super PACs and the dark money and require the disclosure of the names of people making those contributions. And it would also provide public funding to match the donations made by small donors that would help bring additional public money into elections. And those public monies would come from fees that have been assessed on corporations and banks as part of civil and criminal penalties they have incurred. So if the corporations or the banks have been caught redlining, any one of a number of other crimes, and they pay fees, sometimes in the millions and even occasionally the billions of dollars, those dollars would be utilized to match small donor contributions to elections. It establishes ethics rules for public servants, most specifically Supreme Court justices. And it would also prohibit the tool that is more than occasionally used these days when a member of Congress is seeking to settle sexual harassment or sexual discrimination charges, and they use taxpayer money to make those settlements. It would prohibit that. And it would require that presidential candidates make their tax returns public. So it's very instructive to see. For any number of years I can recall, people bemoaning the relatively low voter turnout for elections. And in fact, in 1996, the voter turnout was less than 50%. In the 2020 election, the voter turnout was nearly 67%. And so headed in a direction that one would think we would all applaud. So the question becomes, is voting in the United States a privilege or is it a right? Who should be able to vote? And fundamentally, what is the appropriate role of the government? Is it to facilitate voting or is it to constrain it?
All right. Thank you very much, Sue, for walking us through a really timely topic. So at this point, folks, the floor is yours for questions. We're going to move this back.
John, is anyone speaking yet?
No, no one is speaking yet. And you have started share screen.
Oh, well, I don't know what I'm doing. You've got a new monitor. Let me stop.
There we go. There
Ta-da.
we go.
So sorry. I was Sue. I always learn something new with this, and my heart is moved, and I walk in prayerfully embarrassed. But one of the things that you were talking about was the Native Americans in North Dakota who are on the reservations, and so they have PO boxes, so they're not allowed to register because they don't have a street address. Do you remember back after 9/11 when Bush enacted the Patriot Act? And everybody, it was my understanding that everyone had to have a street address. Does that not apply literally to everyone? And I don't see how they can prevent the Native Americans from voting.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Donna. What I do know that in the context of the voter ID that I spoke about, the state issued ID for Native Americans in North Dakota does not have a street address. It means that they are required to produce some other form of voter ID that would that has an address. And so there are circumstances where, well, actually, there are circumstances where they are able to navigate around that requirement, but it's a difficult and laborious process to make that happen. You cannot simply show up to register to vote with your state ID because it does not have a street address on it.
We make things too hard, don't we?
Liz Sturck, you have a question.
Well, it's kind of almost more of a comment. I remembered what Donna is talking about, and I thought that the post office gave everybody a street address, even if you had a PO box. But I Googled it, and evidently not. And I did get a thing on the Navajo reservation. They had this whole initiative that Google was actually involved with, of coming up with addresses, just so you know, coming up with addresses for people for the 2020 election. So if you want to Google it, it's quite interesting. It was an article in the Salt Lake Tribune, but they came up with, what is it? Latitude and longitude. I mean, some of the, it was like a GPS-y kind of an address is what they came up with a lot of people. It was a Sioux reservation in North Dakota. But anyway, I just thought, but I was surprised because I thought, because my brother lives up in York Lynn and he had a PO box and they gave him, he had to have a street address.
And then the question becomes one of what does your government issued ID show? And if it doesn't show a street address, then it doesn't count as an ID to vote, right?
But anyway.
Other questions? Yes, Carol.
Yeah, so it just got me thinking some more about the whole thing for registering to vote and having an address. And, I mean, I've often wondered, what about homeless people? They haven't been able to vote forever, I guess, because you do have to have some kind of an address, even if it's a post office box. I know in the state of Pennsylvania, you have to list some kind of a physical address. It does require it on the voter registration form. I mean, you can list a post office box if that's where you get your mail, but I mean, I know that it's on the form. I'm assuming that it's always been there. But homeless people, I mean, they're homeless.
There's that population. There are also the population leaving prison.
Right.
One of the very first things that needs to happen is to get an ID. And so there are organizations like Friendship House and others in Wilmington that one of the very first things they do is help somebody get an ID, because without it, you know, there's so many services and opportunities that are closed to you. So now, if you're temporarily homeless, then you may have an ID with a previous address. But for the chronically homeless people, it is another matter entirely.
Well, and it also questions the whole thing of, you know, not having representation and the way in which representatives are determined by population. And in districts like in Pennsylvania, for instance, that has like a big prison in it, and none of those people can vote, but they're counted as part of the population when they're trying to assign a you know, a representative. And the whole thing is just, it's just amazing. So it's not even just race, it's like poor people or incarcerated people. And
Who are disproportionately Black, but yes, indeed,
yes,
it
that
does
too.
apply to both. It does apply to both.
Right.
And it is reminiscent of the 3/5, isn't it?
And so do you know anything about the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act? Do you know where it is right now? Or
It was passed by the House. Actually, it was passed by the House in the previous Congress. It's been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk since, but it was passed. It was one of the first things passed by the previous Congress.
oh, so it could move then forward then.
It could.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find interesting, and I may have mentioned it last week, but in referring to people who've been incarcerated, we've often called them ex-felons, ex-convicts, with a focus on their crime. The term that's being used now in Delaware is returning citizen. And so I emphasize that these are citizens deserving of representation. They are returning to their community, to their homes, to their families, to society. And the work that needs to be done is to assist in that return and to treat them as citizens. And so I think it's an important reminder of who they are and of the rights that they deserve.
Kevin, you have a question.
Sure. I had a quick comment on this because I think there's the potential for some collateral damage in what we would assume to be a reasonable request, and that is to have a photo ID. My mother is in her 80s and she does not drive because of past eye issues. So she does not have a photo ID right now with her picture on it. That's been issued by the state. Therefore, she would not meet that requirement. And I think we could argue that even if you said you go to the DMV and get a state ID, the last place that you would want an 80-year-old to go right now is probably to the DMV. So these constraints we put out there are not all reasonable for everybody, and we are putting our parents in the same bucket.
Absolutely.
What I want to know is just about everything requires an ID. If you want a COVID shot, you've got to not only tell them everything, but they want your driver's license number. They want your, I don't know if it was Social Security, but how do these people function if they don't have IDs?
You can get in the COVID one, you just needed the health insurance card.
Right.
And do these people have health insurance if they don't have a photo ID?
Medicaid does not require a photo ID.
Mm.
And there are states that do not require a photo ID to vote. There are states, if you bring your electric bill and some other proof of identification and residency, all states don't require state-issued photo IDs. And in fact, a number of them we talked about North Carolina. They looked at the range of IDs that Blacks were likely to have versus whites, and there are a range of IDs that are acceptable. They are not all issued by state DMVs. So there's every state gets to make up its own rules in that regard.
Some include gun permits, for example, gun licenses.
Yes, a concealed weapon permit in Texas
Yes.
is sufficient as
Yes.
but not a student ID. A concealed weapon permit ID enables you to vote, but a student ID does not.
Karen Weber, you have your hand up.
All right, thank you, Sue, especially for the positive steps that we can take. I mean, I'm just appalled. I think I never realized until recently how fragile our democracy is. And I just, sometimes I feel very cynical and hopeless and I feel like we've got to get everything done in the next 2 years or something. But I think the last election must have been a landslide for Joe Biden, actually, considering all the suppression that has taken place. It's just amazing. I can't imagine how frustrated people must feel to be denied that right, to vote, or to have it be so difficult. I think we just need to really focus on that, especially, to increase the amount of people that are able to vote. So thank you for your positive steps.
And next week, we're going to spend our time on where do we go from here? And that's going to be on what are the actions that we should focus on? What are the things that we can do? How can we make a difference? And I would certainly ask you to bring all of your thoughts for next week as well. But if we're thinking about a process called truth and reconciliation, we've been dealing with the awful truth. And now we're headed to what is the action that is possible for redemption, reconciliation, forward movement. So I look forward to that discussion and to what happens after that.
Mm-hmm.
Diana Long Henry, you've had your hand up.
There we go. Unmute. Yeah. Yes, thanks, Sue. I hope you had a nice trip in Hawaii. You definitely look more colorful today, like you got some sun. My husband and I were talking about, I was sharing with him how the reincarceration rate, at least in Delaware, how many people, the percentage is so high that, you serve your time, you get out, and then within 3 years, 75% of them are back in again. And I related that to the voting, which someone has informed us about, and you did also. And it just occurs to me that if we give them, okay, you serve your time, and then you get back out there. Well, then they can't vote, and then they have problems. They can't get driver's licenses or cars or something or another. So it limits their transportation to get to work, and then they have problems renting places, so they have no place to live. So you're forcing these people to live on the streets and buy and sell drugs to have income. So it's almost like a catch-22. Like there's no way for them to be productive citizens once they've gone in there and they have a record. But if we gave them, well, not gave them, if they could, once they do their time, I don't know about it, whether they do just the time or do time in probation, then they earn the right to vote again, and they can get maybe even limited driver privileges or whatever, and then give them, or they can rent a place. I mean, at least give them the possibility, give them something to look forward to, especially the ones that have learned their lesson and or whatever, that once they get out, I can do these things, I can be so they can see something positive about doing the straight and narrow, obeying the law. Otherwise, what's the point?
There are a number of organizations everywhere, certainly in Wilmington and in Delaware, that are focused on aiding reentry. And so helping to navigate that process. There is work that needs to be done on funding in prisons so that there is some form of rehabilitative process going on before someone leaves prison.
Yeah.
Instructively, that 75% number, reincarcerated within 3 years.
Yeah.
A significant number of those reincarcerations are the result of probation or parole violation. It's no new crime. It's no new crime. They didn't report a change of address. They didn't show up for a meeting with their parole officer. And
So
when
it's
they
piddling
violate
stuff.
when they violate probation, the first thing that happens is they're reincarcerated before there is any judgment as to whether that is an appropriate step or not. The violation, when reported, results in a warrant and arrest and reincarceration. And so there is work going on to help address that part of the process as well, because what in the world and in what alternate universe does this make any sense in terms of the individuals involved or of the the state population, the state budget? I mean, in any context, it makes no sense. And so that work in preparing people to leave and have a productive life and enabling them to re-enter. A lot of times it's an issue of, if you go back to the same place you lived before and you hang out with the same people you hung out with before, you have a similar result. And so there is meaningful work that can be done, and there is an opportunity for resources, financial and people resources, to be applied to make a difference.
This person that I'm thinking of that I know doesn't have a driver's license because he was incarcerated, and he was out with somebody who did not feel physically well enough to drive. So he was driving her car because she didn't feel well enough to drive. They got pulled over for something or another, and he told the officer what it was, and he's like, "Oh, okay, just be careful with whatever it was." He didn't want to report it to his parole officer because he thought he'd go back to jail. And I forget, somehow the parole officers or another parole officer found out about it. And he's like, the incarceration happened in Pennsylvania. So the guy says, they're not going to come across the state line for a traffic ticket. But you don't know. I mean, you just know that if I get in trouble, the first thing they're going to do is throw me back in.
Yep.
But it sounds like, from what we were talking about today, and especially today, and a little bit what we were talking about last week, it seems a lot like the country is just shooting itself in the foot, because you're doing this, but it's like, if you would just treat them equally, we would be so much better as a country. Of course, the prisons wouldn't be making as much money, but I thought the goal was to rehabilitate and have working citizens working side by side with us in the running of the country. But
a significant shift occurred in the 1970s and 1980s in many regards, in terms of the role of government. There was a view that government was intrusive and harmful, and a lot of the programs that had been put in place that helped build the middle class after World War II disappeared. The social safety net and the shift from rehabilitation to punitive, not just during incarceration, but sort of as you are a criminal and adjudged a criminal, and that punitive view of you follows you when you leave. And so it's been a set of societal norms that have taken hold in our legislation, but they are certainly anti-Christian in any meaningful sense. And so I think that we have a particular responsibility to have our voices heard and see that action is taken so that people have a second chance.
John Lyon, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a comment from my perspective is that there's no simple way for this to be resolved, but it seems to me as though an overall view of the government, at least from the top side, to be able to manage how these things are related to the states. And I know that our government is set up for strictly that the states have as much power almost as the federal government does. But it seems so inappropriate on how all of this, and I'm trying to make it at least a little simplistic, but it's not, on how, what do we do? What could we possibly do to stop this chaotic stuff that goes on? I just, it's beyond my comprehension. I guess I'm not smart enough to think about how do you fix it? What do you do to fix it?
Well, certainly we all have a voice to be heard in our own individual states. And so there are organizations to join, advocacy groups, groups working to address the specific state circumstances. The Constitution does provide for certain oversight by the federal government, certainly in the case when it comes to voting. That clause in the Constitution says that the federal government has the right to correct actions taken by the states. And so having our voices heard at the federal level is important. As individuals, it's difficult to see how we can accomplish too much, but in working together, collaborating, and it's got to be step by step. I mean, at some level, I forget who said it, but it's just so overwhelming. And it just seems like, how are we ever going to make it better? Well, we're going to make it better a step at a time, an element at a time, a factor at a time. And each of us has our own passions for this. And if each of us devotes time and energy and money to the things that we believe in passionately, ultimately action will occur. But in some of these regards, it clearly is a challenge. And if we look at this voting situation across the period of the United States, for African Americans, out of our 250-year history, there was a 50-year period where they were legally, constitutionally entitled to vote. 65 to 2013. The rest of the time, that has not been the case. I mean, it's sort of staggering to look across all that history and see how little of our elapsed existence has actually made it possible, practical for African Americans to freely vote. And so the passage of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, the passage of H.R. 1, these are all critically important actions and deserve of a lot of support and energy, because at a fundamental level, they will make a difference. And then on the state and local level, helping returning citizens, taking actions in support of bills in the legislature that we believe should be enacted, or opposing those that we think should not. We need to make our voices heard. It will ultimately make a difference.
Thank you.
Susan Mack, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I didn't want to belabor the point, but I had worked at the polls back in 2016. And so I just want to kind of add my perspective. And that was the first time I had ever actually been a poll worker. And it was really interesting and eye-opening. We had to, as people came in, you had these big voting books. And I think somebody talked about the signatures, And so really the key identification of the voter was signature matching. We had this book that had their original signature when I guess they registered to vote, where they signed. And then they had to write, sign in the block. And you were supposed to look and see if it looked like it, reasonably looked the same. And you did ask them for an ID, but in Delaware, at least, it didn't have to be a picture ID. But we were given a list of 7 or 8 different acceptable types of ID. And basically, I think it was something that had an address on it. So like Sue was saying, like a electric bill or something like that. So it kind of established that you were a resident and that you were in the right district. And then if you didn't have one of those, you could still, and I can't remember for sure if it was an affidavit that you signed, just that you were registered, or if it was actually a provisional ballot. I can't remember. But you were still allowed to vote, even if you didn't kind of fit into the normal, 99% of the people came in had an ID or had something to show you, and they signed the book, and no big deal. Their name was in the book. But if somebody came in, the name wasn't in the book, or they didn't have some piece of paper, they could still vote. And there was a way for them to vote provisionally, and you had to sign an affidavit saying that yes, you were the person that you said you were, and you were legally allowed to vote. And those votes are the type that if the election's really close and it's within a few votes, that they actually look at, and then they have to verify, yeah, is that person really legally able to vote? And are they who they said they were, blah, 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 blah. So you weren't ever supposed to ultimately just turn somebody away. It was kind of like, okay, we don't have the documentation here, or whatever is on our list of what you were supposed to be able to provide. You still had a way to vote, and you signed an affidavit swearing that you were legally able to vote and you were the person you said you were. So, I mean, when it comes down to it, when they've done these, studies, and there's been various politicians who, we're going to find all the voter fraud, blah, blah, blah. And when they do they try to find people to prosecute, at most they find a handful of people. And it's just, over and over and over again, it's like, oh, voter fraud, voter fraud. And yes, there might be a few people here and there, but it's just such a minuscule amount. The idea that you put these huge barriers in front of people to vote, when time after time after time, they do studies and show that there really isn't a huge problem with voter fraud. So
maybe there's another purpose.
Well, clearly, but
yeah. Well, it's like that with a sledgehammer,
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's very appealing to people, because people say, oh, well, everybody can get a photo ID, or you have a birth certificate, or whatever it is. But there's that small percentage of people that, I read about this guy. This is a previous election. He was some 95-year-old guy in Texas, and he was a Black guy, and he had always lived in this small town in Texas. He had basically never left the town. Everybody knew him. He had voted in every election. And then Texas instituted these new, voter ID laws, and he couldn't vote because he didn't have a birth certificate, even, because everybody knew him. So he had always voted before. Everybody knew where he lived, but they wouldn't let him vote because he couldn't meet the current law. There should have been some way for him to have members of the community say, yeah, this guy's lived here his whole life. He's voted in 60 previous elections. We know who he is. He should be able to vote.
Yep. Well, and the other thing that happens is, while you might have known and offered the option for a provisional ballot or an affidavit, there are those election precincts where someone doesn't have what they need and they are simply told they can't vote. And if they don't know to ask for a provisional ballot, or they don't know to ask if there's a way their vote could be counted, it's not. So there's that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, the training, we were trained for a couple of hours, but even while, even though we had the training, there were disagreements among the workers sitting there like, oh, what do we do with this person? And there was always somebody kind of in charge of the polling place, and they're supposed to know all the rules. So if you didn't know, you're supposed to send them over to that person. That was,
Yep.
yeah. But I could see there'd be a lot of room for potential abuse if.
Well, and it's back to the same question. What is the role? Is it to facilitate voting or is it to constrain voting? What is the purpose? What is the point?
So just
Thank you,
looking at-
Susan.
Looking at time here, we're getting close. So let's do, Kevin and Diana both have hands raised. So if we can make them quick questions, we can cover both. So Diana, I think you had your hand up first.
Actually, I was going to talk to Susan's thing. Jenny, my daughter, was down, I think it was for last year's, for the big vote for 2020. And she's been living up in North Wilmington for 4 years now, I think. She didn't remember adjusting her she didn't know she had to re-register, but because she's got the North Wilmington address on her driver's license, I believe, she couldn't vote down at Newark High School where she's voted for since she was able to vote. And it was like a 20 to 30-minute conversation between tag teaming. Well, Wilmington said she could do it down here. And Newark High School group was saying, no, she had to do it up there in Wilmington. It's like, she's already up there in Wilmington. They sent her down here. And it's like, no, send her back up there. So it's not just Black people. And it's not just old people. And this was just last year. It's everybody knowing the same rules. That's
All
it.
right. Last question goes to Kevin.
Oh, okay. So I was going to say that, so I served as an election judge this past November as well. And in terms of provisionals, they are out there. We did support anybody who came in who did not have a picture ID, but had your election card, for example, as an ID. But we only had 20 provisional ballots for the 1,200 people who were in the precinct. So it's a limited amount that we can actually support. That's just what they gave us. We did emphasize supporting people's right to vote. And then if it got adjudicated later for some reason, then they at least had voted and could later they couldn't go and vote later, but they could possibly have their vote disqualified later for some reason. So we wanted to emphasize that side of things. The thing about having signature match really showed up as a problem last year for two reasons. One was that we had a new system in Delaware where there was a pad where people signed their names on instead of a book. But if you ever try to sign your name on a pad with a stylus when you are in your 70s and you're wearing mittens and a mask, and yes, that's exactly what we have. We have people who had a lot of difficulty doing this. And the ability to match that to any name or anybody's signature, anybody's real signature would have been impossible. We would have disqualified half of them.
And of course, the allegations of voter fraud have to do with, thousands and millions of people and, being this systemic comprehensive problem. And there's simply no evidence of that. So anyway, hopefully HR1 will be considered and voted upon. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate seeing you again this week. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Sue.